So I returned home, and I remember going down. My father was then living at this house, high standing, that he'd bought during the war, in this big estate. There's a cottage on the estate, actually. And everyone said, "Who is it you're marrying? And why isn't he coming over here? And who is he? And what is he? And why why is the marriage to be here?" And I tried to explain that he would no more think of coming to England to get married, as he was very busy. And it was arranged that here I am, and lovely to see you all, and I just have to get a few things like a dress and a few things, And of course everybody wanted to know what this Tony was like and what he was. And strangely enough, my father wasn't in the slightest bit worried. All he said, "I'm sure she knows what she's doing." But I had a very elderly cousin. He was extremely worried. He took me aside and said, "Are you sure this is going to be all right?" And I said, "Well, I'm not absolutely sure, but this is what I'm doing. This is what I want to do." And he's a very fine person. You'll meet him one day. I think I stayed about 3 weeks. I remember I had to visit Tony's aunts, one cousin and one aunt. They wanted to meet me. It was more important than anything that I should meet them and they should see me. And so during this time I drove down to Cheltenham, where Aunt Jessie lived, and really to be kind of vetted. And Tony had told Aunt Jessie that he was marrying this English girl, Sheila Paddon, and she would be visiting Aunt Jessie, and he would meet. And he had told me all about Aunt Jessie and Uncle. I forget his name now. However, I drove down there, and this big house, and this long drive, and a big house, May Place it was called. And I stayed there 2 or 3 days, and it was just like going back in time. Aunt Jessie had housemaids and parlour maids, and I had this big bedroom and so on. And after I had been shown to my bedroom to wash my hands, as it were, I was taken down to the drawing room where I met Aunt Jessie, and she really wanted to know all about me. "So you're going to marry dear Tony, are you?" "Yes," I said. And she said, "Where do you live?" I said, I family live in Essex." "Oh, yeah." Fortescue, yes. And she it's hard to explain to you young people, to anybody else, how things were in those days with that generation, with that upbringing. And she was an old lady. And we talked and talked, and finally she said, "Fortescue's now, Fortescue's, other Fortescue's in Essex." And she said, "There was a Fortescue who married a Howard." And so I thought, oh, good, because I went to school with somebody called Howard. I thought that would. I said, well, I was at school with a Jennifer Howard, Jennifer Howard, let me see now. And I remember her father was Thomas Howard. Oh, Thomas Howard. Oh, yes, and his wife so and so. Yes, that's right. That's right. Now the Paddons, remotely intermarried with Howard somewhere over here. And so that pleased her, and she, you will think she was dreadful snob, but she wasn't. She just liked to know families. Anyway, she was very kind to me, and she gave me lots of little mementos, and she wished I had a very happy marriage to dear Tony, and whenever we were over, we were sure to stay at May Place with them. And the other little anecdote might amuse Dave and Mike was Uncle Dick Paddon was in the Navy during the war, and when he was ashore, he always went to see Aunt Jessie and Uncle, what was his name? It will come to me. And they used to greet him warmly, and they'd say, "Oh, you've been at sea, and you're here now, and you simply must need a drink." And Dick always thought we was going to have a large whiskey or something, but it was lemonade. It was always lemon. Dick used to tell that tale. And then from Aunt Jessie, near Cheltenham, I went into Cheltenham and bought a wedding dress, all in about half an hour, and went on to see Eloise in Bath. Now, Eloise was a sort of second cousin. And she was a Van Summer, and there was some little misunderstanding between the Van Summer, the Eloise's father, and the rest of the Van Summers. There was Aunt Bessie and Aunt Annie, and Uncle Willie and Uncle James. And one of them, I think it was Willie, went off to America and married an American, my dear, named Miss Van Tassel. Brought her back to England, and there was some little problem. Anyway, they settled in Bath, and they had 2 daughters, Rachel and Eloise. And they didn't get on very well with the rest of the family. But anyway, Eloise never married. She lived in a big, tall house in Bath. And Rachel married somebody called Captain Maitland. Those 2 sisters had some frightful row, and they didn't get along very well either. But they never saw one another, though they lived round the corner. So Eloise was a character, as they used to say. So I knocked on her door, and she opened the door, and yes, she said, and I said, I'm Sheila, Sheila Fortescue, and she said, "Oh, yes, you're going to marry Tony. Oh, yes, come in." And I went in there, and she said, "Now, I've heard from Tony that you'd be coming, and he said, give us some sherry to start off." So she brought in a tray with 2 large glasses, and we each had a very large sherry. And it was very funny. And she was elderly, of course. Her father and parents had died. She still lived in this big house with this little dog and a very old maid servant. And she said, "Don't do much cooking, but here's dinner, come on." And we went into this vast dining room, which would have held 14 people at the table. And we had a meal, and we talked, and she was fine. And she talked about the family history and so forth, and the squabbles and so on. And then I left her and I drove back to London, well, back to Essex. And I think I left soon after that. My sister Valerie was very worried about everything. And she did worry a great deal. And she said, well, do you have everything? And I said, well, I have a dress, and I have something to put on my hair. A white dress, I thought. And she said, and shoes? I always remember her saying, and shoes? You got white shoes? Oh, no, I haven't any white shoes. You must go and buy some white shoes, which I did. And my father gave me 6 bottles of champagne, which were all in a big box. And I said goodbye to my friends, Mary and Betty and so forth. And everybody looked very sad. And I remember my father drove me to Heathrow. He didn't say very much, but he said, well, look after yourself and you come over and see us, won't you? And bring Tony along, of course. You come. Yes, we will. We'll come just as soon as we can, I said. And we said just a goodbye. And in those days, you could carry 6 bottles of champagne onto the airplane with no problem. Anything you liked. So I brought my suitcases and boxes and things. I brought a cake, too. A wedding cake in a box. That's right. And I flew back again. And somehow I got all this stuff to Northwest River. And and there was Tony. I remember there was Tony and John was there when I got there. And soon after I got back, it transpired that the nurse was leaving. Would I do the nursing again? Oh, yes. When is the next one coming? They didn't really know. I think I got back in June. The idea was to get married. We got married in September. Oh, I dug out my uniform, back into the hospital, and did the nursing and everything else. And every now and then, Tony would send a message to Dr. Curtis about kind of get a nurse to Northwest River. No. And the summer went by, and finally we decided, nurse or no nurse, we'll be married next Saturday, September the 20th. Come what may, I remember, Dad said, on Saturday. He said this about Monday, you know. Well, I said, well, yes. Well, then Dick arrived, Brother Dick and Lydia. So perhaps they did have a little more warning on that. But I remember the hospital was full, and we were very busy, and it had got all around the community that we were going to be married on Saturday, and there were great preparations going on. I think there were. Anyway, Saturday came, and I was uniform at the hospital, and I remember darting to the church to see if I suppose it was all right. there were a few flowers up there for it. And we were darting back again, and we did an operation. I think we did a hernia. I seem to remember there was a hernia to be done. We did something in the morning, and so 6 o'clock we were to be married, whatever happened. And Jack Watts was to give me away. And I remember going on to the last minute, until around 4:30, I think, giving out the medicines and things. I mean, I had two aides. I had May Suley, who became May Becky, was one aide. She was wonderful. But she was going to help me get dressed and tidy me up and so on. So, and the other one was Minor, became Minor Hibbs. So we left the hospital with Minor, went up to Jack Watts' house, upstairs, took off my uniform, got into this wedding dress. Meantime, Jack was at the bottom of the stairs, calling out the time. Time's going by, time's going by. Are you ready now? And I remember him saying, shouldn't keep the doctor waiting, you know. And this was September the 20th. And so finally I came down, and Jack and I and May walked up to the church, up that little path. It was quite, it's a very rocky little path. And I remember it was quite muddy, not exactly muddy, but rough. And anyway, we got to the church. And Dick was the best man. The church was very full. I think there were people in the basement too. And Mr. Barry the Reverend Barry was the minister. He'd been there for years and years, and he was somewhat absent-minded. However, all went well, and I think little Margaret Paddon was a sort of little bridesmaid, not exactly a bridesmaid, but she did walk along behind in her best dress, and then I think she went and sat down by Peggy, and we were duly married, and we came out and stood on the steps, and suddenly all the guns went off, and I didn't know this was going to happen. Bang, 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 bang. And of course nobody thought to tell me. Oh well, I just hung on to Tony. And together we walked down to the new dormitory building, where there was to be the time, as it was called, the reception. But the dormitory building was not finished, and we were to have the time upstairs in the big room up there, but there was no stairs. There were no stairs. They hadn't put the staircase in. But they very kindly put this ladder up from the ground to this big window upstairs. Seemed quite a natural thing to do. So I gathered up my long white dress, and up the ladder we all went, and in through this opening. And everyone was there, I should think. Of course, I didn't know a great many people. I'd nursed them. Some of them were from North West River and some from other places, but a lot of people I wasn't sure of their names and so on. Anyway, they had a fiddle playing, they had a band playing. I don't know who they were, but they made a lot of noise. And they wanted Dad to dance with me, but he wouldn't. He absolutely refused. No, no, he absolutely refused. A bit embarrassing. Gran was there. She was shaking her head, saying, "No, no, he won't. He never did. He never would." So I sort of stood there. I really didn't know what the procedure was, but they were sort of saying, "Oh, doctor, you must dance with." Anyway, Sid Blake came up. He danced with me the first dance. Well, it was wild. Swung me around off my feet. And they played and they cheered and they sang and the noise. That place was absolutely rocking. And then and there was lots to eat, and it was quite amazing. They had done all this for me and Tony, and wonderful food and music and good cheer, and they were so good and kind and so on. Well, anyway, finally, it all came to an end, and we went down. I was to move into the house, the Paddon house, obviously. So Gran had rearranged things a bit, and she had put me in her room, and Dad was still in his room, and she was in the wing. However, later on, Margaret Blake went into labour, so we spent most of the time with her. We delivered her in my old bedroom in the hospital, that's what we used to do. And so of course, the nurse hadn't arrived, but she did soon after, and I just settled down to married life. In those days, we had a generator in the basement of the house that provided power for our lights and so on. But after a short time, it was decided that we needed something more efficient. And Tony built a powerhouse outside, a short way from the main house. And he installed a very large, I think it was called a Lister diesel engine. And he also put in the small Kohler beside it, and a battery of cells. This worked very well most of the time. We also provided lights for our neighbours. I think it was 4 different houses nearby. And as I remember it, the lights were switched off for all of us at 10 p.m. So it was necessary to go out just before 10 to give warning that the lights were going to be extinguished. We did that by flashing them on and off several times and then waiting a few minutes and then turning off the generators. When Dad was away, it was my responsibility to turn off the generators every night, and mostly this went well. There was just one occasion when I must have made some mistake and apparently depolarized the power. I seem to remember a lot of sparks, and it was very alarming. But eventually it was reversed, and I don't think any serious harm was done. But on another occasion, I remember, after I'd turned off the power and was returning to the house, I think it was probably in January, it was very cold, and I had a pair of boots on, and probably I wasn't wearing the skin boots I should have been wearing, because one foot came out of one of the boots, and I couldn't get the boot out of the snow because it was frozen, and I was left with one leg in one boot and one other leg with just a small sock on it and not able to move. It was very alarming because I was worried about the children who were asleep in the house, and there's nobody else there. And I was standing outside, and when my foot was going to freeze fairly fast, I thought. However, obviously I did get the boot out and the foot back into the boot and to the house, and all was well. But it wasn't a very satisfactory arrangement at all times.
It's August 22nd, 2007, and Kim and I and Mum are in English Harbour, and we're resuming taping some of Mum's memories about her earlier life in Labrador. So, Mum, can you tell us a bit about the animals and the farming and some of your memories of both?
I think that the Grenfell mission in general was very found it very important that we should be self-sufficient, because of course it was difficult to get supplies in those days. And starting in St. Anthony, vegetable gardening was encouraged, and also some livestock were introduced. And the same thing at Northwest River. When I arrived, we had large vegetable gardens. We grew enough root vegetables and also cabbage and so on to supply the hospital and the children's homes, and to send along the coast to the nursing stations. We had a very large greenhouse, very well sited and heated at certain times, and of course dependent in the summer on the heat of the sun. And we started vegetables in that, and then they were planted outside. Ellis Michelin was in charge of the gardening, and he was very efficient and very hard-working, and we depended on him a great deal. We also had a number of cows. When I was there at the early years, we had 6 cows, and I think we must have bred them because they were usually in milk. So I don't remember the bull, but and they calved, so there must have been a bull. They were characters. They all had their own names, and they were milked in the morning, and then they were let out of the barn, and they could wander at will, which they did, and they would wander through the community and down the portage path, as it was known, to the beach, which led them into our garden, and you'd see them coming up through the garden from the beach, and they'd push their way quite often through the clothes on the clothesline. And it was said that sometimes they ate the clothes off the clothesline, but maybe that was just a rumor. I never saw that happen. However, they gave good milk. They supplied the hospital with milk, and we made butter. And of course, we set the milk and we skimmed it for cream, and it was an excellent arrangement. We also had pigs, a number of pigs, and they were fattened and they were killed, and we had bacon. And altogether, we were really, in the essentials, we were self-sufficient. The rest of the supplies came up by boat, a freight boat, and it would come up in the fall, I think it was, for supplies for the winter. So we had to put in a requisition for what was needed to see us through to the following spring. And this was done by the mission, and it was quite an undertaking, I'm sure, because apart from the patients in the hospital, there were the staff and the staff families. So I remember having to make out a list every Saturday for my supplies for a week. Also, we had chickens, of course, great many chickens. So we had fresh eggs all the time. And apart from the chickens that were brought up by the mission, we had our own hens down at the house. And I had been involved in farming just before the war, when I was hoping to carry on with dairy farming. And I had milk cows, and I had ploughed, and so on. But the one thing that I could never do was to look after the hens, and not at all. But we had hens, and they had to be fed, and we had to collect the eggs, and so that was done.
And was there an occasion when you and Dad had to do a cesarean section on a cow?
Yes, that's quite true. We did. We had a cow. She was really due to calve, but the calf had died, and so it was necessary to do a cesarean section on her to remove the calf. And we did that one morning. I suppose, looking back on it, it was perhaps it was a little amusing, because Tony he knew a great deal of anatomy, but I don't think he quite conversant with anatomy of the cow, and we found a very old veterinary surgery book of his father's, printed about 1890, I imagine, and it did give a diagram. So we propped that up on the corner of the barn, and I read it out to him while he proceeded, until I had to help him. And we gave the cow an anesthetic by injecting it into a vein, and or an artery, and vein, of course. And she went to sleep, and the book said, put her down on her left side. So we leaned against her, and she gave way at the knees, and then she gracefully toppled over onto her left side, and we did the section. Wasn't very difficult. Afterwards, we sewed her up and left her alone for a while, and after a while she opened her. They have beautiful eyes, you know, cows with long eyelashes. She opened her eyes, and we helped her up. And the next day, Tony had to leave on the hospital ship for his tour to the north, to the nursing stations, and he gave me instructions what to do if there was any trouble with the cow, but fortunately she gave no trouble at all. And the following year, strangely enough, the same thing happened, and we had to do a repeat section. I think it was after that we had instructions from Dr. Curtis in St. Anthony that we would be no longer keeping cows at Northwest River, and they were to be disposed of. They cost too much money, and now we've had 2 cesarean sections, and it seemed to be the right time to go on to tinned milk. And that was a great calamity, I thought.
Okay, and So Dad was traveling on the Marival at this point in the summer, and in the winter, was it dog teams, or was that era coming to an end?
Yes, by then we there was some negotiation that the Grenfell Mission doctors should be given some flying time and to visit the coastal communities. Before that, of course, it had been dog team for many years, which took many weeks and was very difficult at times, but undertaken, of course, as a matter of course. So I think it was then that Tony started to fly in the summers to all the nursing stations on the coast, and of course could see many more people in much shorter time. It seemed to work very well, as I remember. Although in the summers the hospital ship, the Marival, still continued to make her journeys north with the doctor. And that took several weeks that he would be away. The people were very scattered on the coast, and he always visited every family, always.
Was there one occasion where Fred Rich in Butter and Snow got sick and sent Sandy up to fetch Dad? Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that was in the winter. At a few miles away from Northwest River, there was the Rich family lived there, and the very elderly father was taken very ill suddenly, and his son Sandy came up by dog team to ask Tony to go down to see his father immediately. And of course he said yes, he'd come, he'd get ready and he'd come as soon as he could, which he did. And he went out expecting that the dog team would be there. But unfortunately Sandy had taken off and gone home, back to Butter and Snow without him. And I remember him coming in the back door and saying, well, he'd just have to walk there. And so it was late at night, and it was very cold. But he started off on snowshoes, and he walked some distance, and then, as he told it, he heard a plane behind him, and our pilot had brought the aircraft. Perhaps I should just mention that every evening about 9 o'clock, the pilot, who lived opposite, his name was Tommy Watts, and he was a very experienced pilot and a great friend. Every night he would come in for coffee at 9 and a chat. So he had come in for the coffee and the chat, but the doctor had gone. And when I told him he was walking to Butter and Snow, he went out and he got in the airplane and started it up and taxied along, came up behind him and said, want a lift? And so you could see what a good man he was. So Tony had a lift down and he saw old Mr. Rich and whatever it was and looked after him, and I'm sure Tommy Watt waited outside in the aeroplane and brought him back. That's the sort of thing that happened now and then.
And was this, whenabouts did you have the new hospital? When was that built? And what was that like transferring from the old one? How did they compare?
Well, by 1955, we had really outgrown the old hospital. It was, there was absolutely no space left in it. I think it was built to take about 6 or 8 patients, but there were 22. And when we left, of course some of them were small cots for children and babies, but they were everywhere. And it was not possible to carry on. So in 1955 we started to build this new hospital behind the old one. Quite different construction altogether, and it was a long building, 2-story building, and of course it had enough wards. It had an operating room, sterilizing room, and everything that was necessary, a little isolation room for infectious cases, and a baby's nursery, and also staff quarters and a wing at the back, and a very nice staff dining room, staff living room, and 4 staff bedrooms, and a very fine kitchen on the ground floor. It had a small laboratory. It had offices for the doctor, and various offices that were needed for secretaries. A small mortuary. It had everything that a small hospital needed, and we were very fortunate to have it. However, the nurse who had been for many years, named Jean Smith, who was then back again and nursing as the head nurse in the old hospital, was very reluctant to leave. She had been there for 7 years when I came as a nurse. Then when I was married, she returned again, and she was there, and it was almost impossible to dislodge her. She just sat in her room and said she wasn't going to move, and she wasn't going over to this new place, whatever it was over there that we'd built. And no, she just not at all. Of course, eventually Jean moved, but she didn't care for it very much. And everyone worked on the new hospital, and the people, as at that time, were known as the Indians, not the Innu, they became later. They came over and worked. People came from all around, different places, and came into North West River, and we built it. And it was very fine. But there was just one little anecdote, actually, afterwards, because we had to get rid of the old hospital, which was right in front of it. So it was decided to blow it up. And Jack Watts, of great fame, he decided that the best thing to do was to blow it up. And so I don't know how they did it, but I would have been perhaps dynamite. But in the end, it blew up. We blew it up, all except for the chimney. This ancient brick chimney, which stood there alone for some time and had to be pulled down. But and so the new hospital was opened. We had an opening ceremony, and then we started a lifetime in there.
In 1962, you and Dad were going to go to New York, and you had to start off by snowmobile. Now, can you tell us that story?
Well, every so often Dad had to attend meetings in New York where the directors met, all the directors of the mission. The Grenfell Association met in New York, and usually the doctor, Dr. Thomas and Dad were invited to that. They didn't attend the entire meeting, but they had to present a report, which they did, and then I think they were allowed to discuss problems with the rest of the committee. However, he would go down, and that particular year I was going to have baby a few months later, and Dad decided that I ought to have a checkup. I ought to see somebody. Although I thought I was perfectly well, I think he was worried. And so, good idea, he was going to New York, so I'd go with him and see this doctor, and just for a check. And perhaps we'd have a day or two there, and make a change, and get away for a bit, and so on. And very well. And so we set off. We set off from Northwest River in the huge old navy blue snowmobile. I think it belonged to Hank Schaus, but I may be wrong there. There were several people in it, I remember. I think there were 7 or 8 of us. And I know Zach Dudak was there. And I also remember that from Northwest River up to Goose Bay, there was just a very narrow track all the way. There was nothing cleared. The snow wasn't cleared anywhere in those days. You just went, as it were, along on top of the snow and as best you could. It wasn't a very efficient machine. And we seemed to go along fairly well for a while. A lot of small troubles and problems and stopping and starting, but cut a long story short, at some particular point, about a third of the way up, I think it was, she broke down altogether. And it was decided that everyone should walk on to Goose Bay, except I couldn't do that. And so it was decided that Dad and I would start off walking, and that all the others would go on ahead. And if they found someone else with a snowmobile or a machine or some conveyance or other, they would give them the message that we were behind and we needed assistance and so on. But eventually somebody came back and said that some distance ahead there was a tent, and there was someone in the tent. So that was good. And we would go to the tent and wait there. And he went on again. And Dad and I walked, and we walked. Seemed a long way. But we did come to this tent. I remember it was on the right-hand side, and it was a small tent. And I remember Dad saying, now whatever happens, if he offers you a hot drink, a drink, it could be just water, it could be anything, but it was a hot drink, and it doesn't matter what it's in, if it's in a dirty old can or whatever, you just drink it down, whatever it is and however it comes. Yes, I said I'd do that. So we got into this tent, and there was one old gentleman in there, and he had a small fire, and he had some boughs on the ground. And Dad greeted him, they greeted one another, and Dad and I sat down, and he got the fire going, and he brewed something, hot drink, and gave it to me, and I drank it, and then I think Dad and he chatted a bit, and then they both went to sleep. And I found it most uncomfortable having to sit up on the ground on these boughs at about 6 months pregnancy. However, nothing happened, and so there we were, thinking that eventually the others would reach Goose Bay on foot and somebody would come back for us, which of course they did, because they got up to Goose Bay and they told the authorities there what had happened and that we were back somewhere behind, and of course as things do, it all got blown and magnified out of all proportion. And when help arrived, there was blankets and brandy and a doctor and I think a nurse and people, so many people, and I can remember somebody opening the door of the tent on his hands and knees and helping me out as though I was, in the last extremis of some dreadful condition, when I could perfectly well get out myself and walk into the snowmobile and just get to Goose Bay. There was a tremendous fuss. However, we did get to Goose Bay, and eventually we got to New York, and all was well anyway. But it was rather difficult at the time.
I think on another occasion you and Dad took a bit of a break and went camping, and had a interesting encounter with a trout. Can you tell us about that trip?
Yes, I remember that well. That was a wonderful time. We had a pilot then named Jeff Henderson, and he was quite an individual, and he decided that we should have a few days off by ourselves, and he would fly us to a certain place and leave us there and come back for us. I think we probably left on a Friday morning, and he would return Sunday night, or perhaps Monday, to take us back again to Northwest River. And this was very exciting, because it was very seldom that we managed to go away together like that. And so we packed up things, and I remember he fixed a canoe under the aircraft, under the airplane, or probably not under the airplane, but to the airplane. So we had a canoe for our use, so on. And he flew us to a place that Dad knew of, a lake. I can't remember the name of it. I wish I could, but I can see it very well in my mind's eye. And Jeff knew it well, and Dad knew it well. And he dropped us there with all our supplies and so on, and flew back. And it was really quite incredible, because we were quite alone, just the two of us in Labrador, which I don't think had happened before, not on a little vacation like that. Dad was so pleased, and he knew just where to camp. And we set up the tent, and it was the most beautiful place. And we set up the tent on the edge of the lake, and we had a camp stove, and we had our supplies, and so on. And the weather was good. And I think it was probably the first time that I had camped out in Labrador. And I do remember all sorts of strange noises in the night. Seemed to be very close to the tent, and scufflings and noises and so forth, but of course no consequence, and nothing happened. And then the other thing I remember hearing was this strange tapping noise coming from the shore. We were very close to the water, and it's just tap, tap, tap all the time. And I thought, well, it doesn't sound, menacing or anything like that, so I suppose everything's fine. And, anyway, it turned out that Dad had left his fishing, his rod there in the canoe, and the hook was dangling over the side into the water, and the poor unfortunate fish had been caught by this, and he was slapping against the sides of the metal canoe repeatedly, of course. And it was a very eerie and very peculiar sound, so close by. But in the morning, Tony told me that that's what it was. I presume by that time the poor fish had died, but I remember the sound of it very well in the night.